On a cold night in Missouri, flames tore through a so-called redemption farm, a place meant to reform young girls but remembered instead for its silence. The fire consumed lives, erasing voices already dismissed by a society that didn't want to hear them. Who were these girls, and why were their cries ignored before, during, and after the blaze? Tonight, we uncover the story of the forgotten, the unwanted, and the unprotected. What if the truth wasn't destroyed in the fire, but buried under indifference and prejudice? In the early 20th century, Missouri established redemption farms for wayward girls. On the surface, these institutions were framed as sanctuaries, places to protect, discipline, and reform young women who had strayed from what society called proper. But beneath the surface, they became cages of the poor, the unwanted, and most notably black and biracial girls, placed there not for crimes, but because of prejudice. Life inside the redemption farm was harsh. Days began before dawn with grueling chores, scrubbing floors, sewing clothes, tending livestock. Girls as young as 12 worked until their hands cracked and bled. Smiles were rare, punishment was frequent, and kindness was nearly non-existent. Yet, for many, this was their only reality, a place society had written them into without their consent. Among the girls were those who carried both resilience and sorrow in equal measure. Some had dreams of teaching, some of singing, others simply longed for freedom. Their stories should have been heard. Instead, they were silenced, forgotten, reduced to nameless wards of a broken system. Then came the night of the fire. Flames erupted in the dormitory where the girls slept. Trapped behind barred windows and locked doors, they screamed for help. Some escaped, but many didn't. Newspapers at the time covered the blaze, but the coverage was shallow. Facts distorted, names erased, and investigations abandoned. The fire was remembered only as a tragedy, not as a crime. But was it just misfortune or something far darker? The Redemption Farm fire should have been front-page news for months. Instead, it was forgotten in days. Why? Because the girls who died were not daughters of the wealthy or powerful. Many were poor, many were black, and society considered their lives disposable. Survivors recalled the smell of smoke creeping into their dormitory late at night. They shouted. They pounded at the locked doors, but guards were slow to respond. Some claimed they were told to stay in place until it was too late. By the time escape was possible, the fire had swallowed half the building. Those who made it outside looked back at the inferno and realized that sisters, friends, and dorm mates were trapped inside, clawing at barred windows no one came to unbolt. The official report labeled the fire an accident caused by faulty wiring or an overturned lamp, but whispers suggested otherwise. Survivors spoke of guards ignoring alarms, of administrators cutting corners, of an institution that treated the girls as burdens, not as children protect. And yet, not one administrator or guard faced charges. Not one inquiry dug deeper. The girls' deaths were filed away as if they were inevitable. What lingered most was not just the horror of the fire, but the indifference that followed. In local papers, the victims were referred to collectively, rarely named, their individuality erased. Their race and poverty made them easy to dismiss, and the Redemption Farm carried on. New girls were brought in to fill the spaces of those who had burned, as though lives could simply be replaced. The community whispered, some questioning whether the fire was truly accidental. But fear kept people quiet. To challenge the state was to risk your livelihood, your safety. And so silence prevailed. Every survivor carried the scars, burned skin, nightmares, grief, but also the haunting knowledge that their story had been buried before it even had a chance to be told. These girls became forgotten not only by the flames, but by a society unwilling to face its cruelty. The night of the fire reached its most horrifying point when the screams fell silent. Survivors later said it was that silence, not the flames, that haunted them forever. Dozens of girls never made it out, their bodies found huddled in corners where they had tried to shield one another from the heat. The tragedy could have been prevented. Doors had been locked on the outside, a measure to prevent escape attempts. Windows had been barred, not for safety, but for control. The very tools of confinement had become instruments of death. One girl, barely 15, had managed to pry open a window, pushing younger ones through before the smoke overcame her. Her name never made it into official reports. She died saving others, but her heroism was erased. Instead, the story was written as if the girls were nothing more than a statistic, their deaths a footnote in the state's long history of neglect. When dawn broke, the Redemption Farm stood as a charred skeleton, and the families of the dead gathered outside, demanding answers. But what they received was a polished statement from officials. A tragic accident, nothing more. No investigation, no accountability, no justice. The fire was not just a blaze. It was a final act of system that had devalued these girls from the beginning. The Redemption Farm fire faded from headlines, and history quietly moved on. The grounds were rebuilt, new walls erected, as if the fire had never happened. The victims' names disappeared into records few would ever read. Their families carried grief in silence, while society convinced itself it had nothing to answer for. But memory lingers in shadows. The fire is more than a forgotten tragedy. It is a symbol of how systemic racism and indifference erase lives. The girls were failed in life and failed again in death. Their voices were never allowed to rise, their stories never allowed to shape change. And yet, by telling their story now, their silence breaks. The fire is not only a cautionary tale of negligence, it is a reminder of the consequences of dehumanization. When society decides that some lives matter less, tragedies are not accidents. They are inevitabilities. Today, we can still hear their echoes. Every act of injustice that is ignored, every voice silenced by racism or poverty, continues their story. And we must ask ourselves, how many forgotten fires still burn quietly in our communities, waiting for us to notice? The forgotten girls of Redemption Farm deserve more than silence. They deserve to be remembered, honored, and spoken for. Their fire may have been left unsolved, but their legacy calls us to confront the darkness that created it.